history on some of the major laws. Back Voting Rights Act, the Voting Rights 15th Amendment, which prohibited racial discrimination. The 19th Amendment, which Texas still didn't allow women to vote until the 1920s. The Voting Rights Act in the 1960s as part of the Civil Rights Movement. To focus a little bit on the Voting Rights Act, it protects communities of color and non-English speaking language minorities and prevents any sort of voting law that would serve to make it so that protected communities don't have an equal chance to participate in the political process. And this includes redistricting. And until 2013, Texas was under federal pre-approval under Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, which means that the Department of Justice had to approve any changes to its voting laws. And most importantly, this meant that any new district maps had to get pre-approval from the Department of Justice before they were enacted. But then in 2013, the Supreme Court knocked this down with the ruling in Shelby County v. Holder, and they knocked down the whole pre-clearance regime across the country. And so now, for the first time since the 1970s, Texas will be drawing maps with no federal oversight. But Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act is still in effect, and Section 2 still prohibits discriminatory effects for voting laws, and it was still used successfully since Shelby County was struck down. But it's important that there be, since it's no longer, basically the burden has shifted from the state having to defend maps that it introduces to people having to challenge the maps after the fact in court. And some of the case law that's sort of come out since then has been very negative and really called into question, I guess, when legislators actually have to comply with the Voting Rights Act. And so in order to even have to comply with the Voting Rights Act, basically legislators need to have it needs to be in the evidence that there would be in violation of the Voting Rights Act if they didn't draw districts to comply with them. And so there's 7 factors that Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act looks at. These include history of intentional racial discrimination, the racial block voting in communities, meaning do different racial groups vote differently, and does the white majority group generally vote for the winning candidate while the minority groups vote for losing candidates. Continued social and economic inequalities, racial appeals in political campaigns. And so basically the legislature, I think more than ever, if you're going to make a case that they need to comply with the Voting Rights Act, there needs to be affirmative evidence in the record for the legislature to consider that these are still issues in Texas. And so there's plenty of examples, I think, that we can all think of offhand. The voter purge from last year, where they tried to target naturalized citizens and remove them from the rolls. Some of the, closing of polling locations, the law that they passed that took away mobile voting or straight ticket voting, which generally is preferred by communities of color. But it's important that this evidence be in the record so that the legislature has to there's later sufficient evidence that they need to comply with the Voting Rights Act. And in every redistricting cycle, basically since the Voting Rights Act was passed, Texas was found to have intentionally discriminated against minority groups and violated the Voting Rights Act. And again, because of pre-clearance, this usually resulted in maps being drawn by the courts before they were ever enacted, but it's going to be a harder burden this time around. And this last time around in 2011, the federal court that ended up deciding that Texas had drawn unconstitutional districts really focused quite a lot on the broken process itself and highlighted the exclusion of minority members and sort of the closed door backroom process that led to drawing the maps. Not having public hearings, not advertising the public hearings, especially on the Senate side, it was very egregious. They didn't even let the state senators see the maps until it was basically time to pass them. The leadership actually kept them not even in the Senate building. They had them in an office building outside of the Capitol, and then shortly before it was time to vote, sort of invited members of the minority party up one by one to take a look at the maps that they were about to vote on, but there was no input into the process at all, and no meaningful public commentary. And so the court, highlighted this, and ultimately although the 2011 maps were overturned, the 2013 maps that were sort of an interim solution ended up being upheld by the Supreme Court. But the lower court still admonished the legislature in deciding to not put, I guess one of the issues was whether Texas was going to go back under preclearance, because courts can judicially put a state back under preclearance if they're found to have intentionally discriminated. And the court didn't do that, but it did strongly admonish the state for its continued faulty process, and demanded that they implement a process that by any reasonable definition is fair and open. And just some of the, this is the other issue, I guess, that even when courts do draw the maps, they're severely restricted in how far beyond the legislative maps they can go. Essentially, the rule is that they need to do just the bare minimum to fix whatever legal violations are being alleged. And so our current maps, which, are still terribly gerrymandered, are actually, the maps that came out of the 2011 court case. And so just some examples of what happens when particular communities aren't given a voice in the process and are split apart. This is in Collin County, and you can see basically, I think this whole area here is sort of Plano, and it's split up into these 3 districts, and the darker orange areas are Asian American communities, and so they're all split up into 3 different districts, and unsurprisingly, none of these districts represent the candidate that the Asian American community generally would be voting for. And another sort of egregious split in Bell County. This should be, Bell County is, this is a state house district, and Bell County should be big enough to have a majority minority district within its boundaries, but instead they've sort of carefully split it up to take these minority communities and draw them way off with distant Lampasas County communities. And then campus gerrymandering is also something that you see across the state. And this is Congressional District 35 and the Texas State campus, and how it's basically split in half between two different districts to take away its voice. And so a lot of this, again, coming back to sort of why it's important to have the process for people to talk about their communities. And Stephanie will talk a little bit more about the neutral criteria that people should be looking at to draw districts, but why it's important to have that opportunity for people to actually describe their communities. Because if it's not, I mean, on the upfront end, the hope is to actually advocate for these changes and build a movement and demand that they actually represent people in districts that they ask for. But also on the back end, it's important to have this information so that if there are court cases later, it's documented that people were asking for districts to be a certain way and they didn't listen to the public and drew these for nefarious reasons, because essentially that no matter what the sort of law that you're, the legal theory that you're using, it's always going to be to an extent balancing whether the state had an interest in drawing the districts the way it did versus sort of the harm that resulted from the districts. And so the more that people are on the record testifying for particular districts that they want to see, and the legislature not listening to that, that sort of undermines the argument that the legislature drew these in the best interest of the state. And so some of the procedural recommendations that we've come up with to try to improve the process and allow for this record of public input to be built. The first one basically is pretty simple, just holding public hearings with public testimony after census data is released. And traditionally, the census data comes out in early March of the legislative session, and then the legislative session ends at the end of May. And so it's sort of a big rush to actually draw the maps, but it's the most important thing the legislature is going to do during the session. And so it's not an excuse to not hold hearings and not invite public testimony. And they've been holding these field hearings right now in advance, which are useful and of course are on hold right now, but a useful point to maybe make general recommendations for the process, but it's a little bit limited in terms of how much you can talk about actual districts and what you want to see district look like, because you don't have any of the census data to rely on. And so we're asking, very simply, that they hold public hearings after the census data is released, so that communities can talk about what their new districts might actually look like and what they want to see out of that. And then also to hold more hearings after the proposed maps have been drawn by the legislature, but before they actually pass them out of committee. So the redistrict, each legislative chamber, the House and Senate, have their own redistricting committees, and they're responsible for drawing their own maps. The Senate committee will produce the Senate maps, and the House committee will produce the House maps. And they don't necessarily have to have any hearings on the maps, or they can, introduce the maps at the last minute and just pass them through a formal committee meeting. So we're demanding that they actually hold public hearings also on the proposed maps and provide 5 days notice before those hearings and make the maps public 5 days in advance so that people can see the proposed maps and how they're going to affect their communities and have something to actually testify about, because there are so many different ways that communities can be combined into different districts that it's easier to see a proposal and talk about why it's good or bad than to maybe draw an entire statewide scheme. And then lastly, to not change substantively the proposed map after that public hearing. So don't hold the hearing, let everybody testify, maybe have an okay looking map and everybody testifies and supports it, but then you just substitute it at the last minute before it passes out of committee. So, well, I guess that's it. The next recommendation is for the hearings themselves to actually allow time for them to be meaningful. Typically, they'll limit testimony at many of these public hearings to a couple of minutes, 3 minutes. It's what they've been doing at these field hearings. But if you're actually looking at the details of a full-on district map, it's almost impossible to say anything meaningful about it in 3 minutes. And if you want to produce alternative maps and explain why they're better, that's going to take a lot of time. And so we are asking that the committee commit to having the hearings be long enough that people can actually make meaningful comments on the maps and not just sort of go in and go out without saying anything impactful. And also to provide the capability for people to put forward their own map proposals. Right now, there's no sort of way to show a screen or anything like that or slide. So we ask for them to have the technological capability to do that. Then to explain through a detailed analysis connected to any sort of mapping proposal, how the maps were actually drawn. All bills that go through the legislature have to contain a bill analysis. And a lot of times these are sort of routine, just restating what the bill itself actually does, but not giving any substantive analysis. And so we're asking that they commit in advance to providing a detailed bill analysis that explains why there's any deviation from traditional redistricting principles. So some of those include keeping counties whole, keeping voting precincts whole, the equal population laws. And so having to put forward a justification in writing of why that's done. And also, going back to the Voting Rights Act pre-clearance regime, part of their burden to get maps approved by the Federal Department of Justice was that they had to show that the maps didn't have a discriminatory impact by making it harder for minority groups to elect candidates of their choice. And they had to affirmatively do this analysis and provide it to the Department of Justice ahead of time and show that it wouldn't make things any worse, essentially. And even though the Supreme Court ruled that they don't have to affirmatively do that to the Department of Justice, given Texas's history of discriminatory impact, it's important for us to still demand that they provide that analysis to the public, just as a morally right thing to do, since they have never complied with the Voting Rights Act a single time in drawing districts, that it's incumbent on them to do this analysis. And again, asking for it, and if they don't do it, that helps bolster the case that there was some sort of racial discrimination in how they did draw the maps. And sometimes also, to give the other end of things, it can be necessary to draw what appear to be sort of gerrymandered or, oddly shaped maps in order to comply with the Voting Rights Act, because sometimes there aren't large enough minority groups to next to each other to put into sort of a compact district to elect candidates of their choice. And so sometimes it is necessary to connect sort of distinct communities together to draw Voting Rights Act compliant districts. But there's very strict criteria for how you have to do that, and a burden you have to show that, again, it actually was required to do so to prevent a Voting Rights Act violation, and also that you didn't go too far and start to pack minority communities together where their votes are just wasted. And so as part of that, we'd want them to demonstrate what the sort of voting tendencies of the district are and whether it was truly necessary to draw it the way they did. And then I guess probably many of you all are aware of this, but last summer in the Common Cause v. Rucho case, the Supreme Court found that partisan gerrymandering, meaning drawing districts to favor one political party over another, wasn't a justiciable issue federally, meaning that federal courts, there was no US constitutional limit that federal courts would impose to prevent partisan gerrymandering. And so to an extent, this is seen as giving a green light to many states to avoid the racial gerrymandering implications and just be explicit in trying to look at partisan data, which is, consists of vote history and other measures of partisan preference, and gerrymandering strictly for that purpose. But, there's first of all, there's a large overlap between partisanship and race. And just as a moral matter, I think there's widespread agreement that politicians shouldn't be rigging the system in this way to deny political parties a voice. And also it's never been tested under state law whether partisan gerrymandering is justiciable. And we've seen in other states, as state Supreme Courts have sort of changed composition, that many of them are imposing state limits on partisan gerrymandering. And so we would ask just upfront, regardless of whether it's a justiciable issue or not, to not look at partisan data in the first place while drawing the maps. And this will essentially help ensure that they're not drawn as partisan gerrymandering. And then lastly, to make all communications open regarding proposed maps, there's this idea of legislative privilege that that legislators, lawmakers, staff, and the agencies involved with helping them draw the maps try to invoke, and there's sort of two aspects to it. One is trying to invoke it against Public Information Act requests, just media requests, and individuals trying to use the Public Information Act to discern what's going on. And then also in court, trying to hide behind this concept of legislative privilege, which can be a thorny issue. But again, given Texas's history of discrimination, we think it's incumbent on the legislature to not try to hide behind legislative privilege and to commit upfront that they are going to make all the communications regarding map drawing public, and they'll respond to public Information Act requests when they receive them. And again, given the court's mandate that that the legislature follow a fair and open process, we think that this is in the spirit of that, and that it tends to go against the federal court's mandate that they do so if they refuse to commit to doing this. And then, I guess a lot of worked with Steph and Dave and all the Fair Maps Coalition folks putting together recommendations, and I think Steph's going to show sort of the Fair Maps Texas website that has a simple version of these, and a lot of it was done in the context of when there were field hearings going on, and these being demands that we were making of the legislature and encouraging the public to make of the legislature to get it into the record that people were demanding this process. And we were successful already in expanding field hearings and getting notices put up in English and Spanish and getting them put up in advance and having multiple field hearings in different regions. And we were, the idea is to use that as a platform to make demands for when the legislature is actually in session, that they follow a fair and open process. And sorry, I'm seeing that there's some questions. So like one of these questions is, since the hearings are on hold, when and how is the push to promote the fair and open process? And I think one thing that we can do is still try to collect, from a broader audience. I'm sure many of us here have maybe already testified at hearings, but trying to collect written testimony from different regions, and then either when the field hearings resume, sort of having it as a bundle that can be presented and put into the record, or just having it as, attachment to a report before the legislature reconvenes in regular session. And that was part of the, I think, intent in collecting a lot of this information. I think there's a question about census delay. I think we're going to talk about that after this. And so, these, so I think it's still worth talking to people. If you haven't already testified at a hearing, worth thinking about your testimony and what you want to say, and just some basic points, I guess, that you can think about, and how you would shape your testimony. You just start off with introducing yourself and stating the topic of your testimony. My name is Joaquin Gonzalez, and I'm here to testify about why we need a fair and open redistricting process and how I'm injured by the current closed door process that's led to these maps that are gerrymandered, and give examples from your own districts or how you're injured by the overall composition of districts across the state, and talking specifically about your community and its needs and how those aren't represented. And you can reference the legal problems in the past, and again, if you have examples of barriers to participation for minority communities, it's important to collect those in the record and make recommendations following, we would recommend the Fair and Open campaign platforms. And these are really recommendations for the regular session to help ensure that when the maps and the census data do come out, that there'll be an opportunity for public input on the maps themselves. And then briefly thank the committee for the time. These are a couple websites you can go to. I think that's about it.
Okay, I'm going to jump in and let me pull up the questions really quick. I wanted to go over one of them, Lydia's question. So we're presuming that the legislator is truly postponing these hearings. We don't know what the pandemic is going to look like and how that's going to play out. But we're hoping that they're going to call these hearings back to order when it's safe to do so, I guess. Given that there's a big question mark on that, we are trying to communicate to the committee that we would like them to set up some sort of contingency plan. In the case that we don't get that accomplished, you still have the opportunity to send your testimony in to members of both the House Committee and the Senate redistricting committees. And I can include their information in the follow-up email that I send out with this call. Let me take a note of that really quick. Also, I wanted to talk to Brian really quick. So I know that you say that your congressional district and state and Senate districts, state House and state Senate districts are compact and the communities of interest are pretty well represented. I want to push you on that communities of interest part, and I bet somewhere in your district they have split neighborhoods. There are many communities of interest, and I'm going to talk about that coming up. So I'm pushing you kind of to see if you can find any of those communities of interest. Overall, though, you can definitely talk about how the Republican legislator has redistricted toward Republicans and that it's skewed right now in favor of Republicans. So when people think of representation, they like to think in terms of proportional representation, where if 50% of the legislator was 50% of the votes cast were cast for Republicans and 50% of the legislators should be Republican legislators, right? That's not the case right now, and that's why we know gerrymandering has been effective and used in the state. It's because there is this pretty lopsided skew. So I would push you, or I would encourage you to talk about that in your testimony and say that you don't think that's fair and that it doesn't really reflect your values, or however that might come across in your own words, basically. And then I'm glad Dave joined the call. Dave, I'm going to put you on the hot seat in a little bit as we talk about the census. We've got our two main lawyers in the House, Joaquin and Dave. So we're going to talk about the delay in the census coming up. Dave and I have been chatting today about what that could mean, and he's got some really good insights on that. So, and that's for Joanne, just so you know. Okay, so I want to share my screen now, hopefully, and I'm going to go over my part on nonpartisan criteria for communities of interest for your testimony, basically. Okay, do you guys see my screen? Yeah, okay, great. Okay, these slides, by the way, I will show you at the end our website and where you can find the slides, and I'll also show you the Fair and Open campaign on the website at the end. So what I refer to as a Fair and Open campaign is basically a shortened version of Joaquin's talking points that he developed and that the Fair Maps Texas Coalition kind of vetted and talked about and discussed. And so we've shorten those so we can easily share those talking points on social media, and we're basically calling it the Fair and Open campaign, and I'll show you the website at the end of the call. Okay, so the public input hearings are being held right now by both the House and Senate redistricting committees, or at least they were being held before the coronavirus outbreak started happening. And like I said, we're hoping that this really is just a postponement and that those committees will commit to picking those hearings back up when it's safe to do so. I know that we don't know what the pandemic is going to look like at this point, but that's what our hopes are. But these hearings are our chance to influence the next round of district maps. What they were originally kind of designed to do was to allow the public a chance to tell the legislator where their communities of interest lie. And if you were on last week's call, I walked you through what a community of interest is. I guess I'm going to do that really quick just to give you a quick reminder. So the example that I always walk people through is imagine that you are going out to West Texas and you're setting up a town. And it's like the 1800s, like the middle of the 1800s. What are some of the first things you're going to need to find when you get out there? You're going to need to find a water source, a way to grow food, a way to build your house. Soon enough, you might have a small collection of houses set up. And then, maybe the railroad might come by close to your town. You'll have a grocery store. You'll have other businesses that show up. A hospital, hopefully, or a small clinic or whatever during those times, and maybe even a school. So those shared resources in the community would collectively form basically a community of interest. So all those things that I just talked about, I want you guys to remember as I walk you through this background information on communities of interest. So that's what the legislator is looking for. They want to know where our neighborhoods are located, so they can do their best to keep them whole. At least that's what they pretend to say. What they actually do, though, is they use partisan gerrymandering. They come in very precisely and cut our neighborhoods in half, basically, because of partisan gerrymandering. And so the reason that they do hold these public input hearings, though, is because they have been in violation of the Voting Rights Act for the past 50 years. And this is their good attempt to include the public in the process. In any case, though, I know back in 2011, the House legislators drew their own districts. It was up to the delegation for local counties to draw their own districts. So in Travis County, the House members drew their own districts here, where I am right now, I should say. And so I want you to keep that in mind, that we can take this testimony to our local reps and make sure that they know where our communities are in case that they do get the chance to draw their own maps in the next round of redistricting. So please keep that in mind as well. It's not a complete loss. Okay, so how do we affect change? We provide testimony on our community of interest. Next week, I'm going to be talking to you more about representable.org. This is a new website from the Princeton Gerrymandering Project, and will actually allow you to draw your community of interest online. And we're basically wanting to use this as a ground up method of drawing our own district maps eventually, but I'll be going through that next week. That's the topic of next week's call. So I just described what a community of interest is. I'll read you what the definition is. It's a contiguous population which shares common social and economic interests that should be included within a single district for purposes of its effective and fair representation. You want to be able to have a cohesive voice of representation, so you make sure that you get all of your needs met at the legislature, basically. So I'm going to give you some examples of communities of interest to consider. So any area that has a shared culture or history, lines of transportation, not only lines of transportation, but think of it more as transportation hubs as well. So airports, train stations, anything like that, bus stations, so on and so forth. Weather, so a good example of weather in Texas that we should be worried about is droughts. Areas that are prone to droughts, areas that are prone to flooding from hurricanes, so on and so forth. Common watershed areas, economical regions, and this could be industrial, agricultural, tech, army, etc. Recreational areas, parks, stadiums, so on and so forth. Income status is another one, and that's available in our census data. Housing, languages spoken, schools, healthcare centers, and hospitals, or I'd like to point out the lack thereof in Texas, because I know our rural areas are really impacted by the lack of healthcare right now. And maybe your community has a common goal. Maybe you're trying to reduce crime. Maybe you're trying to increase jobs, especially right now. That's very relevant right now. And that's another thing to consider as well, is our current crisis that we're going through. Travis County, especially thinking of it, and all of our large metroplex areas, our county judges are the ones that are dictating these orders down to help, prevent the spread of the virus. So I would also think of it in terms of the current epidemic that we're going through, the outbreak, the coronavirus outbreak. So if there's anything along those lines that you can think of to include in the testimony, that could be very relevant. For example, maybe your county doesn't have access to testing. That would be something to include in the testimony and say that you're very concerned about that. So I want to give you the nonpartisan criteria that Fair Maps Texas kind of advocates for. We put forth legislation last session, and this is what was included in that legislation, basically. So for the criteria that we were advocating for, we asked, of course, that our districts are all equal in population. And that comes from the Reynolds versus Sims Supreme Court case back from 1964. We also want to make sure that our districts comply with the Voting Rights Act. For our state house districts, they have to follow the county line rule. The county line rule means that if you can fit a whole district within a county, you can't cross county line. I mean, that means that our state house districts are going to be a little more compact. Importantly, though, we want to base these districts upon communities of interest. We want to respect city lines, county lines, and neighborhoods. And like I said, we want to respect those communities of interest, which I've just talked about at length. Compactness is another one that you can consider, but it's not way up there on the list. And then nesting. Nesting is another one for everyone to think about. Nesting means that, for example, your state house district is going to be contained in your Senate district, and your Senate district is going to be contained in your congressional district. And that means all of the residents living in those three districts would have, overlapping representation. So all of those needs that you guys are concerned about, you would just have three people to talk to about those needs, basically. Right now, it's really bad. Lydia, out on the west side of Houston, oh God, how bad is Katie right now?
Now, ask me again, Stephanie.
So out on the west side of Houston, I know that your state house districts, I think you guys for the town of Katy have, how many house districts do you have out there?
We have in the Katy Independent School District, we have about 6 state house representatives. One of them that is drawn into the Katy Independent School District, at the time that it was drawn, only represented 3 children. And then the Senate, I believe, has either 3 or 4. And the congressional district is almost as bad as the Texas House district. So when you look at our school district, the representation is by so many different people that it's really tough to believe that you're being represented. Only one of the Texas representatives lives in our district. All the others have no contact with our district.
So when you look at areas like this, what you're trying to optimize is, again, maybe just 3 people that you would have to go to as a community. But Lydia's example has shown that her community has to go to at least, I don't know, 15 different people in order to get their needs met. And research has shown that when you crack these communities as such, like in Katy, what happens is those representatives aren't on top of your community's needs as much as they should be. If you had one representative, they would be very responsive and know what the problems were in your community. But when they're split across multiple different cities, multiple even geographic areas, it becomes very difficult for that representative to be able to keep up with all of these diverse areas. And as a result, they're not responsive to the people anymore. So just quickly, I want to give you 3 different websites that you can go to if you're interested in starting to draw your own district maps. The first one is District Viewer. This comes from the Texas Legislative Council. This will show you what our current district maps are, and it will show you everything from US Congress all the way down to State Board of Education. Next, if you're interested in drawing your community of interest, you can check out representable.org. This comes from the Princeton Gerrymandering Project. And we will be spending our next call on this website, basically playing around with it, trying to draw communities of interest. Another one, if you want to actually draw a map, a district map, the software District R comes from Tufts, the Metric Geometry and Gerrymandering Group. It's available online right now for free, and I believe it's a pretty decent software, I guess you could say, online software that you can use to draw district maps. And then if you're truly serious about drawing district maps, I do have a copy of Maptitude available with the league if anyone is serious about it. And I know Joaquin is, and I have yet to get it up and running. But if anyone is interested, I can make that a top priority in the upcoming week. Okay, and this was just the rest of Joaquin's presentation. Quickly, I want to show you the websites where you can find some of these online testimony guides and such. So this is a Fair Maps Texas website. Can you guys all see this? I'm still sharing the screen. Okay, so here's our Fair and Open campaign on the front page. You can click on this box and it'll take you over to our Fair and Open campaign. I have videos of testimony of people echoing the campaign. They're awesome videos, you should watch them. We did a press release for our Fair and Open campaign, so if you want to read through the press release, it's at the top. But importantly, like when you scroll down, here are the advocacy points from the Fair and Open campaign. And we have graphics that you can also share on social media if anyone is interested in doing that. These points were basically the stuff that Joaquin talked about in his talk, and we've laid them out for you here on the website. So these slides, at least the ones from my presentation, you can find in our toolbox. So if you go to public input hearings, we did have the schedules up for the public input hearings, so you can find those on the website. But like I said, most of them have been postponed and some of them are going to be rescheduled. So that should be changing soon. Our testimony guides. So here they are. Here is Joaquin's guide to communities of interest. Sorry, this is mine. This is my nonpartisan redistricting criteria. So basically, I have stolen this from California. If you guys were on last week's call, I walked you through what the California Independent Redistricting Commission looked like, how they set their commission up, and how the commissioners went about drawing their district lines in a fair and open fashion. Like I've mentioned before, they have highly prioritized communities of interest. And so the example testimony that I give you toward the end of this guide will give you an example of communities of interest. And it's actually pretty decent testimony, I thought. Okay, so that's my guide on nonpartisan redistricting criteria. Joaquin also has his guide up, and these are the recommendations for the fair and open process that he walked you through. These are basically a copy and paste of the slides that he put up. And then he also has given example testimony as well. So if you want more help on preparing testimony, you can find it in either of these guides. And then the PowerPoint presentation that, at least my slides that I walk through, are available on the League's website. Or apparently you can download, I've downloaded the slides for you. Here we go. So my slides are all here. I believe Joaquin's fair and open process are included at the end as well. Let me double check. Yes, so Joaquin's are also at the end. So that's on the the Fair Maps Texas website under public input hearings. Okay, so now that I've shown you that, I think the last thing for us to do is talk about current events. And Joaquin talked me into talking about the delay in census data. Dave and I were concerned. I had a lot of people emailing me yesterday. A lot of people were panicking. I guess it was on Monday when they announced the delay in the census data. And there was a lot of speculation about what's going to happen, and a few reporters were commenting on it, and they were doing this wild speculation. And so as a result, they had all these people emailing me. I want to let everyone know that this is like a very, very complicated process. And I'm kind of dumbfounded that all of these constitutional scholars like Justin Levitt and some of these other really important lawyers aren't commenting about this online right now. And their silence is kind of a good indication that they're all in the same boat that I am in, like, oh my God, what's going on? How do we navigate these waters? Joaquin did want to talk about it. Dave's on the phone, so I'm hoping Dave's going to chime in too. Dave Jones from Clean Elections, Texas. He's an attorney from the Dallas area. He actually has a really good understanding of all of this. I have notes that I've like thrown together at the very last minute about all of this, but I was kind of hoping that you two, because you guys are the lawyers in the group, would kind of lead the conversation a bit, if you don't mind. Oh, wait,
I don't know if you're talking, Dave, but I think you're on mute.
Yeah, can you unmute it?
But well, I can jump in while you figure that out. I thought it'd be interesting, though, just to briefly look at some of the, I think, the three provisions of law that are impacted or that sort of are in play with each other in intention, and could be interesting to see how it plays out. Do you mind turning off your screen share, Steph, and I'll put something up?
Yeah, sorry. Let me see if I can figure out how to do it.
All right, so I think the sort of background principle that will be tested, I think, is the one person, one vote constitutional principle. And, you know, this was a case from the 60s. Basically, for many years, states they often use like counties as the basis for districts, but not equal population counties, like just each county would have their own legislator or something like that. So, you know, in places with large cities, those counties would just get one single vote, and then some tiny rural county would get a whole representative to themselves. And for a long time, the courts refused to weigh in on that until Reynolds v. Sims and some cases leading up to it. And they sort of announced this principle, constitutional principle of one person, one vote, and that there's a, you know, basically woven into the Constitution is an idea of equal representation. And they recognize that populations are always changing, so you can't constantly be updating districts, you know, every year based on population changes. And they decided that decennial was a good basis because of the census, and that was a rational basis, you know, time to read our district. They said they didn't, you know, that states could maybe do it more often than that. And, but this is sort of the key language that I highlighted. While we do not intend to indicate that decennial reapportionment is a constitutional requisite, compliance with such an approach would meet the requirements for maintaining a reasonably current scheme of representation. They say that more frequent reapportionment would not be necessarily wrong, but if reapportionment were accomplished less than every 10 years, it would be constitutionally suspect. And so if we are getting, the data in July of 2021 instead of March of 2021, I think it would be in tension with this principle that you would wait till 2023 to redraw the district just because the state law says something else. And this is the state constitution or provisions about drawing districts. This is just state legislative districts, the state house and the state senate, and basically provides that the legislature at its first regular session after the census data is provided will draw these districts, and if it doesn't, then this legislative redistricting board composed of lieutenant governor, speaker, attorney general, and all these good guys will draw the districts. So I think an open question is, let's say the census data comes out in April or May during the regular session, does that mean, and the legislature doesn't have time to draw districts, are they going to try to use that as an excuse to say, well, the legislature didn't do it at the first regular session, so now the LRB gets to draw the district? I don't think that's what the intent behind this is, and I think it would be legally challenged, but you could see that being a move that they try to make. And the other aspect of it is it says at the first regular session, so let's say it doesn't come out during the 2021 regular session, does this then mandate that in 2023 they draw districts regardless of whether they draw interim districts in a special session or if a court redraws the districts in 2021 because of one person, one vote issues? This sort of might imply that regardless of that, in 2023, they'll have to redraw the state legislative districts. And then the last thing is the federal congressional single member district law. This was passed, well, there's been some version of it around for a long time, but it was never enforced. And then they sort of tweaked it in the 60s. But it's basically the law that says that each federal congressional district has to be a single member district, because for a long time, many states just elected all their Congress people at large as a slate. The whole state would vote on all the congressional seats. But interestingly, it says, so, after whenever it is the census, gets the data to Congress, Congress will reapportion the congressional, the representatives among the states, and Texas will probably gain some congressional seats. And so it says, until a state's redistricted in the manner provided by the law of the state, if there's an increase in the number of representatives, such representatives would be elected at large by the state, and then the other representatives from the single member districts that still exist. So you could see them maybe trying to argue that if we don't get the data until after the legislative session, we don't have to draw districts till 2023, and we'll just keep our current districts and then elect the additional 3 Congress people at large across the state. Again, I think this would be subject to a one person, one vote challenge. And if you're trying to elect Congress people at large across the state of Texas, probably a Voting Rights Act issue, but it's something that you might be seeing arguments over. So I don't know, those are just sort of the interesting provisions of law that I thought would be at issue based on all of this.
Dave, did you get yours? You're unmuted now, right? Oh, it's still not working. Hey, unplug your headphone set. Maybe that'll help.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, now we can hear you.
Can you really? Okay. I don't know. Maybe there's something wrong with my microphone. I was using this one earlier. Yeah, you can hear me okay now?
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Sorry about that.
No.
You know, I don't know that I have a lot more to add other than what Joaquin said. It's all sort of up in the air. I think that, you know, that there's since we have this state constitutional requirement as far as picking especially the state legislative districts in this real specific way, it kind of depends on when when the census comes out. But if it is published while our first regular session is still in session, I mean, it seems like to me that there might be a pretty good argument that they have to do it during that whatever limited time it is that of that first session that remains, and then if they fail, that then there's the alternative process that's in the state constitution for this silly LRB procedure. So, I mean, that's that I'm sure that people will certainly make that argument. I mean, Joaquin raised some great points about how there may be subject to contest based on Reynolds v. Sims and the federal statute, but it's I don't know. It seems like that there's going to be a preference in following the state process as long as it isn't too far. I would expect the courts to allow the state to follow their process as long as it's not too far afield from Reynolds versus Sims, one person, one vote idea, or the statute. But I mean, obviously it's going to be different for congressional districts, but it's the state districts. I think there's probably going to be that could be an issue. But if it does, say we don't get it till July, then it is going to be profoundly delayed. So some of the other constitutional issues may come up. I don't know that I have a lot of insight to give beyond just what the law is, what Joaquin pointed out. It's never happened before that I know of.
Yeah, I don't think so either. I think this is the first time the census data is actually going to be delayed. So I want to walk you through some of the current events really quick. Let me share my screen before I open my keynote presentation. So just to give everyone some background information, on Monday, the Trump administration, along with the Census Bureau, asked Congress to delay the census. So they want to delay the delivery of the census data to the president and subsequently to the states. And so they want to delay to the president. Usually it would be delivered to him by December 31st. Now they're trying to delay that until April 31st. So that's 4 months. And then for delivery to the state, technically they have had until April 1st to deliver that census data. But now they're trying to delay that to be July 31st. I do want to emphasize, though, that this is a bipartisan effort. This isn't conservatives trying to manipulate the system, which I'm still kind of wary of, to be honest with you, because of their past recent history of trying to manipulate the census. But there is a good amount of bipartisan support, actually a complete bipartisan support for delaying the census, just because of the coronavirus and field operations are not safe right now. Vanita Gupta is the chair of the leadership conference. It's this very large, I think there's more than 100 organizations in this coalition. She manages it basically. And she was quoted in the New York Times recently, actually I think on Tuesday, saying that yes, she also agrees that the census should be delayed, the field operation should be delayed until June 1st. And so when I saw her saying that, I was a bit reassured that, okay, they are making the right choice. Not only that, but again, on Tuesday, 4 previous directors of the Census Bureau wrote a letter to Congress also urging them to, that they agreed with that 4-month delay that the Trump administration and the Census Bureau, sorry. Hold on just 1 second. I don't know. Sorry. Lucky me to have the fire alarm go off in the middle of the talk. So she also agreed, though, basically, and the former directors of the Census Bureau also agreed that that was the right thing to do. And I have a quote from them from that letter that they sent to Congress, basically advising them that that 4-month delay in this whole timeline was appropriate. Joaquin already pointed out the relevant sections of the state constitution, and he's already talked about that. I just also wanted to point out that the backup commission, the LRB, can only work on state legislative maps. They can't touch congressional maps. So basically the governor would have to call a special session, or they could possibly wait until 2023 to draw these maps. If they did wait till 2023, I guarantee you there will be a lot of people that would try to file suit for that one person, one vote ruling under the Equal Protection Clause of the US Constitution, basically, that our districts are so lopsided right now because Texas had the most growth over the past 10 years of any other state in the nation, that our districts are so lopsided now. Plus we have 3 new congressional seats that we should be getting. So I guarantee you there would be a lawsuit filed. Probably by me. Dave pointed out that, again, it's all in the timing. Our legislative session ends May 27th. And so typically what happens with the census data when it comes back from the Census Bureau is that we get it in Texas. They say April 1st, but really what happens is we get it mid-February or the beginning of March. And so if they do decide to pass that census data back to the state before that May 27th deadline, there could be a real possibility that the legislator would then proceed to draw those maps. Again, it's all in the timing. We're not quite sure what's going to happen. May 6th, also I wanted to point out, was a deadline for the House committees to report House bills and joint resolutions, but that's more of a technical deadline. House rules don't really dictate or clearly defined an express deadline, and we should probably look into that, hint, hint. If the governor does not call a special session, Dave pointed out that we could file an equal protection claim, but we would have to wait till the very last moment for him not to act in order to be able to file a claim. And then Dave also pointed out that the state could claim that this delay in redistricting was due to extraordinary circumstances, which it is. And so that could bolster the state's claim that they want to wait to 2023 to redistrict. And so everyone just be prepared for that. Okay, so that kind of concludes the census. I want to talk about really quick the letter that we had proposed to send to the Virginia legislator back on our first call. I don't know if Mary's on the phone right now. Mary Cullinane from Common Ground for Texans. Let me stop sharing my screen. Mary, you're not on the phone, are you? No. Mary wrote a very nice follow-up letter for us, for constituents and citizens of Texas to send over to members of the Democratic members, I would want to say, to the Virginia legislator. So a few weeks back, the Virginia legislator actually became the first legislator ever in the US to willingly give up their power of redistricting, and they passed a constitutional amendment to give that power to, it was a mixed commission. So some of the commissioners are going to be from the legislator, and then some of the commissioners are going to be citizens. But they were the first legislator to actually step back from the process. At the last minute, Democrats kind of withdrew from the process. Democrats have power now in the legislature. So we wanted to thank the Democrats that held true to their word. Mary wrote this great letter, and so in the follow-up email, I'm going to include her letter that you guys can send to the legislators in Virginia now as a thank you note, because I know a lot of people are really big into sending follow-up emails and thank you cards and postcards and stuff like that. And Dave, Dave actually wrote to the campaign director for One Virginia 2021 and found out who these Democrats were and got their contact info. So thanks, Dave. And then I think the last thing I wanted to talk about, what was the other one? Oh, I just wanted to give a quick update on Wisconsin. Last week at the end of the call, we talked quite a bit about Wisconsin and what was happening there. So I wanted to fill in everyone that, okay, so in Wisconsin, they decided to hold their elections last week in the middle of the coronavirus pandemic. And there were mistakes made on both sides, don't get me wrong. It was conservatives pushing to hold the elections. The Democratic governor there didn't start moving on all of this until it was too late, basically. And a lot of people weighed in, their state Supreme Court weighed in, the US Supreme Court even weighed in. And the result was that they all agreed that basically Wisconsin still has to hold the election. And so a lot of people showed up. I want to say it was like 1.2 million people showed up, and some of them cast their ballots remotely, but not everyone was able to cast their ballot. There was a lot of confusion. Apparently, the US Supreme Court ruled that, and this was apparently Brett Kavanaugh, decided that when he wrote his ruling that he said that basically these ballots need to be postmarked by election day, which was whatever that was. And that postmark in that ruling, the word postmark actually, I guess, caused a lot of confusion. The way that they postmarked the ballots, the post office did in Wisconsin, it didn't always clearly label the date and stuff like that. And so some ballots were discarded. So that's something to look at and consider as we move forward in this age of the coronavirus. At any rate, the reason why the supposedly, allegedly, why Republicans in the state wanted to hold elections was because of a state Supreme Court position that was up for grabs, basically. And it looked like the Democratic progressive candidate for the state Supreme Court had a real chance of winning the election. And so conservatives thought by holding the election, like an in-person election, they would be able to suppress the vote and prevent people from voting for that person, basically. And at risk, there were conservative groups in the state that had sued the state. They wanted to basically enact a voter purge that would have possibly disenfranchised 240,000 people. This is a state where, because of past voter suppression since 2011, Trump was able to win the state with as little as 23,000 votes. And apparently how did it go? The voter purge there in 2016, there was an estimated 17,000 people that could not vote. So it was a very close margin. So any more of this voter purge problem would have impacted the next presidential election. And so that was why the Supreme Court race, the state Supreme Court race, was so important, because it basically, that Supreme Court candidate, Supreme Court justice, will determine the outcome of that voter purge case. And so last Tuesday, it was announced that the Democrat won. So hopefully now definitely now the voter purge case will be shut down. And hopefully it will give Wisconsinites a fairer chance at the ballot box. So that was good news. Does anyone else have anything else to add to that?
You know, there was another thing I heard. Somebody else may have heard about this too. I think the Sixth Circuit ruled in the case involving the Michigan Independent Redistricting Commission.
Yes, I was going to talk about that next week.
Yeah, just on the Wisconsin thing, I should mention that, everyone's really excited and people came out and they wore masks and they really overturned it. But behind the scenes of that was 500,000 postcards sent by Indivisible. and 275,000 postcards sent by Postcards from America, and just mountains of phone banking, and even before the shutdown, block walking. So it was this huge amount of effort behind the scenes to get out the vote and to get people to know about mail-in ballots and things, and to, you know, to try to, and then of course they tried to be allowed to submit them later if they didn't arrive on time, and that failed, and they still won the seat by a pretty strong margin. It was through effort. It's not just because people were watching the news and realized that they were being messed with.
I didn't know that. I didn't know there was such a large get out the vote effort behind it.
Even California Indivisible sent a huge amount of postcards, and Postcards for America, a huge number of postcards.
That's great.
Yep.
Do you want to post the information on some of those groups in the chat box? Oh, wait, you're on mute.
Came out in a discussion on, I don't know if you know who Robin Alperstein is. It came through the discussion there when she posted about the success in Milwaukee, in Wisconsin. So I'll follow up.
Yeah, so next week, we're going to talk about, for our current event, 2 court cases. Dave, I hope you can join us. Maybe.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. I don't know that I know. Which 2 cases are you going to talk about?
Well, I was going to talk about Michigan with the appeals court ruling today, upholding the Michigan Citizens Redistricting Commission. So that was good news. But then also the one that we had talked about in Colorado, because there was a challenge to that as well.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so that was.
Yeah, I just heard that about the Michigan case. I hadn't actually read anything about it. So I guess that was correct. They did decide it today, right?
I think it was unanimous too. So.
Oh, was it really?
Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting, because I listened to the oral arguments in that case, and it sounded, there was one judge that sounded pretty skeptical to me, but that's great. That's really good. It's cool, man. Those people worked really hard to, it's great that it's going to get to happen, hopefully.
Lydia, did you have a question?
Yes, I have a request. On your follow-up email on this call, could you include the link for our April 20th event with the Texas demographer that will be talking about Fort Bend County?
Do you want to tell everyone about the event right now? And I will definitely do that. And I have planned on including it in the newsletter that I wanted to send out.
Now, say that again. I couldn't quite hear you.
Do you want to tell everyone about it right now? And I definitely will include it in the follow-up email.
Dr. Lila Valencia will be our speaker on April the 20th. She will be focusing on starting off from the big picture in Texas and zeroing in to Fort Bend County and discussing the demographic growth in that area and the implications for redistricting. It's typical of the presentation that the House has been having from the Texas Demographic Council at each of the hearings that they've held already across the state. So if you've never been to a hearing, this is an example of how the House begins the hearing process to hear testimony. So I encourage all of you to tune in. Like I told another group this week, we tend to be thinking about our own areas and how they're going to be impacted by redistricting. And one of the things that we're not quite aware of is that our area is often partly a consideration in somebody else's area when they go to drawing the lines. So it behooves us to be aware of what is going on overall. So join us on Monday, 7 o'clock. Thank you.
I do want to point out that Fort Bend County is one of the most diverse counties in all of the US. So it's going to be, and it was in 2011 as well, one of the places where the legislature chose to really heavily gerrymander. So it'll be interesting to see what the outcome is. So I'm so glad that we have Lydia. And I'm so glad that we pushed to get a hearing in Fort Bend County so we can get a lot of people from the community on record with the legislator talking about their communities of interest down there. So we have it for the future if it ever comes to litigation, basically. So yay. All right. Yeah, and I will include the link for the webinar on the follow-up email tomorrow. Does anyone else have any other comments or anything they want to add? No? Okay, well, thank you guys so much. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next week. Okay, bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thanks.